Yes, ma'am. I think the recording started.
Okay.
We'll begin. A very warm welcome to Miss Poorvi Satija today. I will be talking about the Vis Moot inherently, both Vienna and East. And I'll be asking ma'am around 4 questions just to make sure that we cover a substantial ground when it comes to understanding what students need to prepare for while aiming to perform well at the Vis Moot itself. So, ma'am, the first question posed to you today, which has been recruited from a lot of our juniors as well as our peers in the Indian student community. The first question would be that how does one manage preparation having access to only a limited amount of resources when universities across the world have different degrees of access to commentaries, subscriptions, and other academic resources? As you may know that India obviously is not the most active in terms of resource building, especially for Western authors. And arbitration is inherently a very Western concept, which still has to take very firm root in India. So Indian literature is dearth anyway, and Indian access to literature is also very low. So how do you think students can prepare better and compete with their Western counterparts?
I think this has been a challenge for a number of years, ever since I was in law school and we were competing. So it's unfortunately a reality and a constraint of the world that we're operating in. I think competitions are alive to this tension and the fact that there is, inequality in terms of access to resources, and some of them are trying to work towards making it more equitable in the sense that I'm aware that Youth Mundai has just tied up with, Jessup as being the official research partner, and I feel like as if COVID continues and the pandemic continues, we might see some more of that collaboration. But at a university level, I think what you can do is lobby your own university and try and get access. It's not always easy because resources are hard to come by, but use the resources that you have at your disposal. So use your student bodies, use your representatives on the student bodies, on the moot court committee or whatever is the equivalent in your own university, and try and use them to lobby for better research access. Speak to your librarians, and in the worst case scenario, if all else fails, I think you should also be open to being a little more enterprising in the sense of reaching out to publications. There's no shame in requesting trial access, especially if you really think from a Google search that this particular article or this particular thing could be very, very determinative, or could be really insightful for the issues that you have in dispute. Another creative or not so creative way of doing that is calling favors from your friends. Very often you might have friends who are on exchange in other universities with better access, and that could be one way of doing that if you're not burdening someone too much or bothering them too much. That could be another way of doing it. Having said all of that, for the Vis Moot, I think your most important resource is actually free. It's the CISG database that is available by a collaboration of Pace Law School, and it's really that there is a lot to be said about the availability of materials on that database. I've not found it lacking in all of my years of working on the Vis Moot, and the CISG is going to basically be your go-to source for your substantive law arguments. The difficulty is more in cultivating resources for more arbitration specific arguments. But again, like do feel free to try and reach out to publishers or platforms and explain the situation to them, and maybe request trial access would be one practical suggestion.
Certainly, ma'am. I think that's I mean, it's very important that we all go ahead and become enterprising. I think that's one of the key words that I'll take from that answer, because when we are aware of our situation of not having a lot of resources, then we have to work our way around it. And I think that's an incredibly intuitive answer. And I think we can move on to the next question. I think the next question posed here would be that how do you think that the mindset and marking criteria per se of different judges from different jurisdictions, how would you feel like those varying understandings and various different exposures of common law, or let's say civil law judges, or different, just the fact that different jurisdictions inherently would make them have different legal experiences. How do you embattle that when it comes to how do you appeal to all the judges in a uniform manner, or do you think it would be better to appeal to them individually in your speeches?
I think this is a this I'm not sure how well this is replicated across the other arbitration moots, but this is one of the goals of the Vis Moot, sort of bringing together the common and civil law perspectives,
Yes.
and with that aim, there are always these hidden gems in the problem where there may be differences of opinion between common law and civil law jurisdictions, and also they work a fair bit to try and get when they're putting together a tribunal, they try and get both common and civil law
Yes.
lawyers on the panel at any given point of time. And I think the way to deal with that is at the stage of your memorials, whenever you're trying to substantiate any point that you're making, to the extent possible, substantiate it with, as I tell my team, one case law and one commentary, so that
Yes.
you appeal to both, lawyers of the common law inclination and the civil law inclination. And similarly, I think during oral advocacy, I think that is less of an issue in my experience, because the timing is so short that you're not basically citing an authority for every single point that you're making. And so I think for effective oral advocacy, that distinction is not as important in my experience and opinion. I think at a memorial stage you can cater for it, but at the oral advocacy stage, it doesn't make so much of a difference which legal background you come from, because if it's good oral advocacy, you are going to impress,
Right.
irrespective of the background of the judge. And so the focus should just be on developing your arguments in such a way that you deliver them in the most persuasive manner. And that should be the goal that you should be working towards. And I'm not sure, I've not at least experienced or encountered the background making so much of a difference at that stage.
And so, ma'am, how would you address the idea of, let's say, courtroom? The courtroom demeanor that obviously is instilled in every student, especially in the Indian subcontinent, in a particular manner, which is to an extent a bit more animated or a bit more dramatic, for that matter. And arbitration moods obviously have a lot more docile or a lot more calm expectations of a demeanor. So, how would you think that when you have judges from different legal orientations, and different jurisdictions may have different kinds of advocacy sort of flair, for that matter, within the courtroom, how would you feel that behavior would make a difference? What kind of a demeanor would you suggest?
I think there's a difference when you're preparing for a moot court competition where you're going to be addressing a judge, and that again varies from the forum, right? So, for example, the manner in which you will address a judge in the Jessup competition is very different from how you would address a judge in the ICC criminal law moot court competition. Is different from arbitration. Is different from, let's say, the national trial advocacy competition. So there's definitely a distinction to be made between when you're addressing a court and when you're in an arbitration. It's a little less formal. Tribunal, you're not likely to address the tribunal as your honor or your lordship, and that's often a mistake that I see Indian teams just beginning to make the switch from litigation moot advocacy to arbitration moot advocacy. And so it's a little less formal. You're expected to address the tribunal as the tribunal, or Mr. President or Madam President, or members of the tribunal. So that's one little distinction. Another thing is that I've often noticed teams do is that they tend to be very too deferential sometimes to the tribunal, with the same kind of mindset as if they're addressing judges.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to find the balance between being respectful and professional, but not necessarily sounding
Really different.
deferential.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes a fine balance, and a hard one to find. But with practice, I think you can definitely get there. I think the key to arbitration advocacy in these moot court competitions is that you need to be professional throughout. but respectful to the tribunal.
Right.
And there needs to be a little more infusion of commercial practicality and how things would work out in the particular industry. That sort of knowledge is always appreciated. If you can bring in some real world insight into your advocacy, if you can really simplify something that is a complex legal concept and make it understandable to a lay person, I think that is really always the gold standard for advocacy in these sort of competitions.
I think that is the goal that you have to achieve it, and if you can manage to convince a layman of what you're saying, then you've done well with your argumentation, definitely, ma'am. The next question that we have for you is that now that we have this pandemic, and I think this is going to be one of the most important questions to answer for this year, especially given that all the rounds are going to be conducted online, following suit from last year's Viz competitions. How do you think that the mindset, the marking criteria, the expectations of judges and arbitrators across the globe have changed since the rounds are now virtual as opposed to physical?
I think more or less the marking criteria remains the same, in the sense that you still look for the same kind of things. You look for good advocacy, you look for convincing arguments, you look for how persuasive the team is being, and how coherent their arguments are in terms of, is there consistency between their arbitration arguments and the position that they're taking on the substantive law and how it all ties in together. We're looking for good teamwork. We're looking for, I don't think those fundamental things have changed.
Right.
If anything, I feel like there is probably, at least in my own judgment and evaluation, I have seen that I've started to become a little more generous or kinder, because you're accounting for the fact that there is a difficult, this is like a common sort of difficulty that everyone is facing, and that interaction is definitely easier in real life than it is through this artificial medium of a video platform. And one thing that I think has gained significance, which was always important, was the ability to think on your feet, respond to questions, and be flexible and adaptable. And I think the importance of that quality has really gone up, because if you face technical challenges, you are just going to have to adapt to the best possible situation in that moment and not hold up the proceedings. And how you do that.
True, ma'am. I mean, when you're making the speech as well, I'm sure most participants will have to account for some kind of a technical glitch just beforehand itself, as a safe parameter to go through with. So I think that flexibility and adaptability is a wonderful kind of an expression when it comes to how to prepare yourself better for a virtual setting. And I think the entire arbitration community has found it the easiest amongst every other legal practice to sort of transition into this virtual space, because arbitration inherently also was very virtual to begin with, even before the pandemic. And I think that element of it has just gotten exasperated. So I do believe, from my limited exposure as a student, that while it may be challenging, it will definitely be something that can be adapted to. And if you can manage to make the most of it, then as a participant, you'll be given the right points for it.
Exactly. And I think it was always an important skill, right? Because how well you respond to questions, because those are not something that, even if you've prepared to the best possible extent, there are going to be volleys that are going to be thrown at you that you will not have anticipated or not have known how to answer. So that is a skill that has always been important, but I think in recent times it has gained significance. Another thing that I think has happened is that impressive advocacy has become even more important and harder, because within the limited framework of not being too dramatic, or not using hand gestures or hand movements, and being limited to the video format, you still have to impress and hold people's attention and command people's attention over a video format, which I think is harder to do than in real life, because Zoom fatigue is quite real. So to be able to, hold the tribunal's attention, pay attention to the other side, all of these things, I think have become more challenging, but also more important. And I think active listening is something that might be really helpful to you for participants for competitions, because again, it's very easy to tune out when the other side is speaking on the video format, because it doesn't feel as real as it would, and some of the adrenaline and pressure of being in a room with these few people in Vienna sort of adds to the atmosphere, and you're all charged up. But with the video format, you may not experience that same level of compulsion to pay attention.
In your bedroom, when you're sitting just well dressed, you might not feel. Certainly, ma'am, I think that active listening is a very important point you've made here, because that's something that, yes, certainly people will have to adapt to, because it Zoom fatigue, very true, especially for the last entire year that we have all been learning or conversing through our screens before us. I think it becomes all the more important for everyone to be a little bit more aware of the virtual challenges before us. Wonderful, ma'am. I think to cap off, I would have the final question here, which would be that in your experience as a judge and as an arbitrator over the years, teams would have made the cut sometimes by the thinnest of margins. And in most cases, obviously, they all have very similar arguments, especially at that higher level, in which most teams would have covered all bases that they possibly could have. So, what do you think might be the X factor, or any kind of a particular point that you may, any magic recipe of sorts that you may have that may give you the edge over your opponent in a particular round?
I don't think there's one magic ingredient. I think it's a sum of different parts. And I think the most important ingredient is definitely preparation and hard work. I think the amount of time that you put into preparation really starts showing, especially at the oral advocacy stage and as you advance through the round. The second thing is creativity, where again you have to teams will have similar arguments at the end of the day, but they may have very different ways of presenting them. And I guess that's where the creative element of that advocacy comes in, and how you set yourself apart by just articulating the same argument differently, I think really can help. The other thing, like I said at the beginning, is the ability to translate complexity into simple concepts, and I think some teams do that very effectively by the use of examples, by the use of analogy, and if you have a look at the final round of all of the past years Vis Moot, you will really see the way in which teams set themselves apart by different ways of bringing in creativity and setting themselves apart just a little bit
There's
by that.
sharpness and I think precision, and the arguments are well constructed and succinct. And I think that also impinges on one very good important tip that many watchers, very many viewers of ours today might get help with, is that to just keep on getting more and more examples of speeches before you in your preparation. I think many students skip over that part sometimes, in which they don't really get experience of how to speak because they haven't really watched all of that free content available. So I think that's a small kind of a point to make here, which was always be ready to go ahead and watch those videos and prepare best, because that's the best example you can come up with.
Having said all of that, I would also say that there is something to be said about luck of the draw. I've been in very heartbreaking situations as a coach where I've had occasions where teams have broken literally at the top of the grid in the general rounds, only to be kicked out in the round of 64 or super early on, and then when you get the results 2 months or 3 months later, it's really heartbreaking. And so I wouldn't say that, I mean, I'm not generally very superstitious, but I think sometimes you just have to resign yourself to how the situation plays out, and how some things are outside of your control. So the thinnest of margin point often is a source of heartbreak for a lot of teams. But I think that's just something that is beyond your control.
Sure, a lot of teams have a source of contention as well with the thin margins. Because it's very difficult to gauge what the tribunal may be looking at, and where you may have gone wrong, especially at that level, because you've finessed your arguments to such an extent and you've gotten there, and then to not understand or be able to gauge as to what you did wrong can definitely be very frustrating. And I think, ma'am, with that, I will invite you to just give some final remarks to any viewers watching as to, because they're nearing their pre-moots and obviously they're nearing their actual rounds coming close. They're just done with their memorandum submissions. So how would you feel? What's the next possible thing they should focus on at the current stage of their preparation?
I think in terms of the next stage, it's really, really important to select your best arguments. So in the memorials, the approach that teams tend to usually follow is that they tend to be as exhaustive as possible and develop arguments and then their alternatives and further alternatives. And I think one key step in the transition to preparing for the oral advocacy stage is to select and zoom in on your most important and the most powerful arguments. So that's one key transition to make. Another thing to do is to practice a lot. So try and fix up as many practice sessions as you can with other teams, because one of the distinctive features of the Vis Moot particularly is that you are expected to learn and pick up arguments from the other teams that you compete against, because the goal at the end of it is educational. So you are expected to learn from your interactions with other teams, as long as you're not conflicted with them and subject to the rules. You are expected to get better and pick up better arguments, even if they were not, like, you're not being held to whatever is said in your memorials, because that's sort of a different competition and is judged and scored at a different stage. So there is a real opportunity, even if you were, for whatever reasons, if you were disappointed in your performance at the memorial stage, you should not take that to heart. And very often, your performance at the memorial stage is not going to necessarily be indicative of how well you end up doing at the oral round. So it's really important to sort of put that behind you and treat this as a almost separate competition, because you're expected to grow and learn. So fix up practice sessions with teams, take part in as many pre-moots as possible. And I think with the pandemic, one good thing that has happened is that it has made everything very, very accessible. In the past, and I know that I've struggled with this, representing and being coaching a lot of teams from India, is that it's a real issue of accessibility, in the sense that most good pre-moots happen in Europe. Anyway, your budgets are so constrained that it's very hard to find additional funding and put together money to travel and participate in pre-moots. But this year it's all virtual, so you have a lot of new opportunities, and technology has really opened the door to you in terms of even fixing up practice sessions. And in the past few years, I've seen Facebook groups really take off and have a life of their own, in the sense that people get together and collaborate and fix up sessions and practices, and I think that's really, really important, because for teams from India who may not have very many coaches, it's a great experience to just try and practice against some of the consistently well-performing teams who have like 20 coaches and one diction person and one person specifically for coaching them on the oral arguments, one person doing just memorial coaching and things like that. So it's a really interesting and a great learning experience to go up and against teams like that who have consistently had a good track record and institutionally tend to do really well at the moot. And so I would say just utilize all of those opportunities that are available to you and practice really hard. And the other thing that I would encourage you to do is at this stage, start thinking about, again, how can you make your arguments more and more accessible? How can you break them down? And I think your friends may be very annoyed with you by the end of it. At least my friends were very annoyed with me by the end of the process. But it may be helpful to just talk to your law school classmates, your friends, your parents, your siblings who may have no background or no knowledge of any of this, and try and see how they react to your arguments when you tell them something. And your greatest marker of success is going to be if you can, get your point across somewhat, even if not fully,
Right.
to someone who has no background or no knowledge or no idea about what you're talking about at the beginning of the conversation, but by the end of that conversation begins to get what you're talking about. And I think that really should be the goal that you should be working towards.
Definitely, ma'am. That's wonderfully put. And I think our viewers will have a lot of wonderful insights to take from this conversation here. I thank you very much for taking out time from your busy schedule today, and we're very glad that you could share all your thoughts here. And we look forward to putting this up as soon as possible. Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much. Thank
Have a
you.
great
Thank you.
weekend. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Yes. So yes, ma'am, as I was saying, that we started this platform inherently because we noticed that there is a vacuum of accessible information that can be received by students primarily. As students ourselves who love arbitration and the field, we realize that there is not a lot of student accessible and a lot of student oriented platforms out there which would either cater to student authors or would even make information or any kind of knowledge as freely available as we would like it. So with the lack of resources and the dearth of knowledge that we were seeking, we thought if there's a vacuum, why not fill it? And that's the reason why the six of us came together from different schools across India to create this review over the course of the pandemic, effectively speaking. And surprisingly, none of us have actually met each other, but we just did this virtually and we started it off.
You'll find that as you practice more in this field and gain more exposure, you actually make great friends that you've never met in person.
Yeah,
so this is just the beginning of that kind of career and professional relationship building.
We look forward to that thoroughly, ma'am. And as luck would have it, we sort of gained a lot of traction in the Western Hemisphere more than India itself. We got a lot of authors from Europe and the US primarily. And so we leaned into that. We obviously decided that, if we're getting traction, then why not just go ahead with it. But then we started this series as the mooting season starts. And we realized that, we want to make good on the promise of making it a lot more accessible and diverse, especially for the student community. And so we realized this can be one of the best ways to enter into that arena. And therefore, we started this program of Arbitration Connect. And you would be one of the first practitioners to shed light on inherently to be a Vis Mooty and how to prepare best. So I'll start with a small introduction, ma'am, and then we'll begin with the questions.
Perfect.
So today we have with us Ms. Kiran Nasir Gore, who has been a legend in the field of arbitration for over a decade. She serves as the counsel at the law offices of Charles H. Camp. She's a professorial lecturer in law at the George Washington University Law School. She's also serving as the associate editor of Wolters Kluwer, of the Kluwer Arbitration blog, and associate editor of the Exit Review. She's an ambassador of the very important racial equality of arbitration lawyers, and most relevant, and I believe the most promising proposition here is that she has been a coach and an arbitrator of the Vis Moot for over a decade. So, ma'am, without further ado, if all said and done, I think we can start with the questions.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me on.
No, ma'am, it's our pleasure. So, ma'am, the first question that was raised to us by our peers as well as our juniors was, what are some of the key questions that arbitrators consider as essential for effective oral advocacy when the oral rounds start?
So where I would start is actually before the oral rounds. I go back to the research and the briefing process in the Vis Moot. And here, what you spend all those months preparing for, I mean, there's an entire phase to the moot before oral advocacy ever starts. I say that oral advocacy is the reward for all the research and writing that you've done. And here, technically correct arguments is really the focus of your preparations, both written and oral. So when you get to the written phase and then you move over to, excuse me, my phone is ringing. Sorry about that. When you move from, you want me to start over again?
No, that's perfectly fine.
No, go ahead. Okay.
Yeah.
So when you move from written to oral, you need to let it shine that you have all that preparation and technically correct background, and then also understand how it fits broadly into the field of arbitration. You should understand how jurisdiction and what jurisdiction means for the mandate of the tribunal. You should understand enforceability and the New York Convention and how that plays into the tribunal's mandate to issue a sound award. The tribunal is focused on its own job, its own mandate. And what a tribunal aims to do is render a good award, a technically correct award, an enforceable one. Why? So that they can get appointed again, right? I mean, arbitrators are selfish in their own right. They want to have good accolades for themselves, and they want to draw upon those for future appointments and promising work. So when you are faced in that oral advocacy round with questions, keep in mind what the arbitrator is thinking. The arbitrator, of course, wants to hear technically sound arguments, which you as a mootee have spent the past 5, 6, 7, 8 months preparing for, but they also want you to help them do their job. So keeping in mind this bigger picture goal that the arbitrator has regarding their jurisdiction, their mandate, the aim of their award, that is really the goal. And if you guide the arbitrator along that path, what I like to say is that you do the arbitrator's thinking for them and do their job for them and show them that you're along the same route as they are, then there's the advocacy side of it, which is that you have actually undercut the arguments of the other side because you've made yourself more compelling to the arbitrator. You're in tune with their mandate and their purpose, and you can guide them more effectively and more trustingly on that path. So keep that in mind. It's really about the arbitrator's thinking that is really influencing the kinds of questions they're asking. And if you can foreclose those, if you can get there faster than the arbitrator and predict what's happening in their mind, and you're really just making your own advocacy even stronger.
That's wonderfully put, ma'am. And I think that's very important for any aspirant of the Vis Moot itself, which is to identify or to an extent preempt what would be required of them in their answers. And that's something that I personally have been practicing in my years as a mootee as well, in which I do allot a certain amount of time for just the tribunal's questions within my speech as well, because I understand that if I can sort of coalesce my answers and also make the point that I have been wanting to make in my speech anyway, I think we can, that kind of coalescence is something that the arbitrators would be.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, you come to your argument with so much preparation. You have a roadmap. You have the points 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that you want to make. And along making those points, you never let the questions that you receive from the tribunal distract you, but rather help you along. So if you prepared adequately, if you are in tune with the argument, then really it all complements one another, right? It's not that the arbitrator is your distraction. And I know as a student, as a mootee, I was a mootee, you're so anxious and nervous when you get asked a question. It's like, oh, I'm getting off track, but it's actually not that. It's that you're being kept on track because there are very few arbitrators in the Vis Moot world that are trying to harm you, right? They're not trying to make it hard for you. They're actually trying to challenge you and push you forward. I hope that they're pushing you forward and not holding you back. You might have some time constraint issues. I appreciate it's not a perfect symbiosis, but it is a relationship where you're all working towards the same goal. And exactly as you say, you have this roadmap, you have the points you want to make, and the arbitrator's comments should only help propel you forward. And if you think of it that way, I think it becomes a much more freeing exercise.
Definitely, ma'am. And I think that's very wonderfully put. Now, that kind of leads into the second question as well, that you spoke about. I mean, we've identified to preempt and to understand what the arbitrators are thinking. Now, in that, when you have that leeway that's provided to you, what would be the importance of unique or creatively crafted arguments? Because you obviously will have at that high level, you will obviously have very razor sharp arguments, and all sides therefore will prepare in a very uniform manner. So creativity and uniqueness, how much would that be rewarded from a judge's perspective?
It's a really good question because I think it depends on the stage of the competition. In those very early rounds, in the first preliminary rounds, I would say that creative arguments are absolutely secondary to making all the correct, technically correct and required arguments. You must talk about whether there's a breach. You must talk about how the CISG applies. You must talk about whatever the procedural or jurisdictional questions are, and back them each up with the obvious answers. And I don't mean to minimize the role of creative arguments, but first you have to have the obvious answers. You have to have the answers that the other side is responding to. You have to have the answers that the tribunal is expecting to hear. But as you move out of those preliminary rounds, as you've moved on to the elimination rounds, that is where the opportunity for creative arguments really appears, because it's there that there's a given that there's this bottom line quality check, right? Everybody's on the same level. You're all doing a great job at that point. If you've made it through any elimination rounds, whether it's in Vis East or in Vis Vienna, that means that you're a star. Like already it means you're a star. So what you start to do at that point is say, okay, well, not only can I do all of this, but I've got this up my sleeve, I've got that up my sleeve, I've got that up my sleeve. And that is where, at least in the arbitrators' minds, during the deliberations, they start saying, well, they did a great job covering all the points I was expecting them to cover. And then they had X, Y, and Z very creative arguments. I'm not sure they were persuasive. I'm not sure I buy it, but they were technically correct. They made sense. They made me think. They challenged me as an arbitrator. And maybe that's why they win this round. Because the thing to keep in mind is that in the elimination phase, it is sudden death, right? It's not let me rank you all and give you all points and add it all up, tally it, and see how it turns out. It's actually either this side wins or that side wins. And in a sudden death environment, if you have something that distinguishes you, that extra bit of creativity or flair or comfort, it can even just be comfort. It doesn't have to be creative arguments, but comfort in your space and your environment and in your advocacy, those are distinguishing features. And sometimes in that elimination phase, it's no longer about the argument, because everybody can make the argument. You've all proven that you can make the argument. Now it's about, well, what can you do that's special? So I wouldn't even separate out creative arguments from some of the other aspects of oral advocacy that you all are practicing. You know, it could just be being comfortable in your own skin and being a really great partner to your teammate, that you guys work together in a really collaborative way. It doesn't have to be creative arguments. I think those become very difficult to find at these very high stages because, as I said, you all have spent 7, 8, 9, 10 months preparing for this. And in doing so, you found all the arguments. There are very few arguments you can come up with that no one has thought of before. But there are other things you can do, which is just the creativity to your presentation and the partnership with your teammate and those kinds of aspects.
I think that's a wonderful, man. That just the idea that the mood itself is a lot more than just what you're speaking, and advocacy would involve a lot of different elements of creativity, demeanor, and teamwork. And I think that's something to keep in mind for any aspirant moving ahead. Wonderful, ma'am. I think the next question would be that when you are in the thick and thin of those questioning, and when you're deep in the middle of your speech and your thought processes, how do you sort of compose yourself, and how do you answer a challenging question by an arbitrator? Is it appropriate at any given point? And I think this is something which would appeal a lot to Indian students, because we have been drilled in our preparation, in our training, not to concede your point until you're absolutely down on the mat. So would you say that conceding at any given point is advisable as opposed to just stretching the argument out?
It's a really good question. Let me back up and give a few other points of advice first. Number one is, if you are in the hot seat, the first thing you need to do is maintain your composure. And one of the best ways to maintain your composure is taking a deep breath and grounding yourself in your seat, planting your feet firmly on the floor, right? We're all seated while we're doing this, and taking it in stride. And part of the taking a breath, it's not just good for your diaphragm and your oral advocacy skills and just keeping your head about you, but it's also take a breath and use that moment to collect your thoughts. You are more nervous about silence than anybody else in the room. Everybody else just thinks you're being very thoughtful. Everybody else might not even notice that you took that breath, but taking that moment to collect your thoughts is incredibly important. So not when you're doing that little breath that you're taking, you're not only deciding what your argument is going to be, but you're also, just testing the room and saying, okay, well, what's the approach? And it might be that you want to go head to head with that arbitrator and really face that challenge and advocate your position, or it might be you decide to concede after a certain moment. I will tell you that going head to head with the arbitrator is probably not in your interest in that way, because the arbitrator is not necessarily trying to tell you you're wrong, but trying to take you on a different path. Very few Vis Moot arbitrators are there because they're belligerent and they don't want to help you as students, right? They're there because they want to guide you and challenge you. So if arbitrators making a point that is contrary to the one you're making and saying, oh, well, take this scenario, or what if the alternative comes out? Go down the path with them and then return, right? Earlier, I mentioned you have your roadmap, you have your points that you wanted to make. You might need to concede a few points to win the overall argument. And think about, well, what do I actually need to win? Do I need to win on every nitty-gritty detail? Do I really need to convince the arbitrator that the witness statement says this and therefore it means that? Or can I still win this big picture argument without that point? And can I tell the arbitrator that, saying, well, even if I concede your point, I still win, right? I still win because X, Y, and Z, and therefore this argument still comes out in my favor. So keep thinking about a couple of things. One, the arbitrator is there to make a decision, and they can still reach a decision in your favor. And you are there as an advocate. And I know as a student, it's very hard to understand that sometimes because it's very fictionalized, but you are there as an advocate for your client. And you always want your client to win. You don't have to win every argument to have your client win. And there might be, and you see this in the Vis Moot every time. I mean, there are alternatives. There are alternatives to the alternatives to the alternatives. So pick your battles very wisely. If you see one argument isn't winning the day, well, you've got another argument and another one and another one. And you can be very responsive to the feel of the room, the arbitrators, and then also the other side, right? We've been having this conversation as if it's just you and the arbitrators in the room, but it's not. You also have your opposing side, and they may have those, everything that we just talked about. They may have those creative arguments. They might have those really great advocacy skills, and they might have a very nuanced view of the facts in the case. And you need to be responsive to what they are doing very much. So it's a matter of you getting a feel for the room, but also the partnership, right? When you're doing the advocacy, you cannot be doing everything. You have your teammate there being your eyes and ears and your timekeeper and everything. And I know in this virtual world, maybe none of this applies, but it's still a matter of fact that you have support. You're not in that hot seat alone. And there's a lot to be said for what you can do together as a team rather than separately. And that's real life. I mean, an oral advocate in an international arbitration proceeding is nothing. I mean, of course there's something, but they're nothing without their second chair, that person who's helping guide them through the documents and the arguments and keeping track of time, looking at the other side. Sometimes it's not just arbitrators. Look at the other side and see how they're reacting. We all are human, and I think we have tells, right? We give away how we're responding to something, and you might cut something. And your teammate is there to help you with all of that.
That's wonderfully put, ma'am. And I think that encapsulates everything that takes place in that room. I think being wary of your surroundings and every single actor in that room is extremely important when it comes to gaining composure in the first place. And then automatically you always have to understand that you lose a few battles but win the war. So I think that's the best way.
That's very nicely put. Very nicely put. Absolutely. And keep in mind, you can't win a battle or a war or anything without being calm and having your wits about you. So something I do in my supposed free time is I also teach yoga. And so taking a deep breath is so important to everything you do in life. I even teach that to my kids. Like, you've got to take a deep breath and stay calm, and you don't get frustrated, you don't get anxious. You stay grounded in the space that you're in, and none of what we're talking about in oral advocacy can be achieved without taking that deep breath. And then it's the energy, right? I mean, energy is a real thing. You put out energy into the world, and you want to put out positive energy, confident energy. You want to put your client in the best light. I mean, you can do all of those things when you're calm and composed. And I know in competitions, the stakes are high. I know in real life, when you have clients, the stakes are even higher, but you can maintain composure and really progress things in a positive light when you're in control. And you can't be in control without really keeping yourself grounded in the space that you're in.
Certainly, ma'am. I think staying calm is one of the underrated lessons that are not really spoken about a lot. And I'm glad we touched upon it here. And I think that kind of leads, because we spoke a lot about behavior and composure, that kind of leads me to my next question, which is uh, you mentioned that you have to put on a confident energy out there to sort of, and that in itself, just the way you're presenting yourself, even if your arguments might not be as technically sound or as I would say convincing to an arbitrator, if you're putting it out confidently, you automatically might reach out to them a bit more. So how important do you think is the element of flair or the element of some kind of a confident display in such situations?
So I'll start by saying don't be overconfident. I mean, this moot is a fictionalized problem. What's nice about that is that, and I experience this every year with my teams. We look at the problem and we assess it and we figure out, okay, well, on this procedural issue, claimant has the better argument. On that procedural issue, respondent has a better argument. You kind of win on breach, you kind of lose on breach, right? Every year we assess. And one thing that's for sure is it's never a clear winner. There might be the easier argument to be made, but it's never a clear winner because it's a problem. And Professor Kroll and the others were involved with drafting the problem. They've been doing this for years and they have a lot of fun with it. And it's never a clear winner because they put nuggets throughout that show you, okay, well, you can argue that point and you can kind of play with that point. So keep in mind that unlike real life, where sometimes there is a clear winner and loser, in the Vis Moot world, there's the easier argument and the harder argument, but you always have enough information to make the harder argument. So you should never concede a point in the sense that you think you're going to lose on that argument overall. There's enough that you can argue it. And that is all buried in the facts and law. So as long as your writing process and your research process and go back to the problem itself, just because you've spent so many months with it doesn't mean you can't learn new things when you go back to it again, because it's designed that you can keep learning from it. So I would start there. Keep in mind that the arguments are not win or lose. So knowing that, to answer your question on flair, well, use that to your advantage, right? Use to your advantage that you might have more cites to the record or more details in the record. The other side cited this witness statement saying it turns out X, Y, and Z way. Well, you can cite that same witness statement and cite the next sentence and say, well, it's not so black and white. Here's more. And that's the kind of flair that I think is really encouraging to tribunals. I think it really distinguishes teams. I've been involved in elimination rounds many times over the years, and you always see that it's the team that just spent more time with the problem. And the flair comes from that. It comes from knowledge. It doesn't necessarily come from any showmanship. And I think we need to be careful, right? When we talk about, well, what is flair, right? It's not just the snazziest suit and I have the best showmanship. It's actually in the argument itself. And you can win that in many different ways. And sometimes it is by some of the other things that we talked about, conceding a point, by being humble, by understanding the bigger picture, right? Understanding arbitration practice and law better and how this case fits into that world better than maybe the other side, right? Maybe there's nothing in the problem about enforceability of the award, but we all know that arbitrators want to render enforceable awards. So if you can work that into your presentation saying, look, I understand the landscape we're operating in. I understand arbitration procedure and law, and I understand that enforceability is a real risk here. Let me talk to you about that. That's flair, right? That's proving that you know how this works and that you understand how this environment is operating. And that's distinguishable, right? The tribunal hears from all these arbitrators, especially in the elimination rounds, they've done this before. They're not newbies. So they all understand that is the extra mile. So if you ask me about flair, I think of those kinds of aspects more so than anything that might just be style. I think style is great, but we're all not Jan Paulsen, right? We're not here to develop style necessarily. We're here to work towards understanding the law, understanding the procedure, responding to the tribunal, responding to the counterparties, and style will come over time, right? That's something you develop over time once you've gotten comfortable in those spaces.
No, ma'am, I think that's extremely insightful because I think one of the major influences of of a law student inherently is a lot of, I would say, entertainment and a lot of media outside, and that automatically sort of makes you a lot more elusive, or a lot more, I would say, attracted to the style and the flair of it all, or everyone's stylish and snazzy and just portraying themselves in the best way possible. But I think you put it very well, which is that flair should never be hollow. Flair can only be substantiated with knowledge and with, it's more confidence about how much you know and how much you're aware of the situation. That'll give you the flair as opposed to just style. And I think that's wonderfully put. Ma'am, I think the next question that I would have is that when, and I think this sort of ties in to just end it all, because I think you've already answered about the thinnest of margins and how when you're in the room itself, you have a lot of different things to sort of take into account, and you can obviously cut out the margins there, even when you have very similar arguments, as when you're comparing yourself to the opponents. I think that changes when it happens virtually. And so I think that's just one thing that I would sort of ask you to shed some light upon, given that this year would be virtual. How do you think that that would be different, and how do you think all the demeanor and all the teamwork orientation that you've spoken about, which would be certainly lacking in a virtual space, how do you think that will factor into things?
So this question that you ask is one that real practitioners are grappling with today too, because the rise of virtual spaces in the advocacy setting is somewhat new to us. We've certainly had it for a long time, but what's definitely new is that you may have the same team in separate places, which means so much in both real life, but also in the Vis Moot environment. And I was an arbitrator and a coach last year when we were suddenly virtual. So there was quite a lot of newness to that. So there are two ways to think about this. One is, are you there in the same place as your team? Are you all together virtually, or are you actually separate virtually? And those are very different experiences. I think if you're virtually together, you can certainly think about how you come across as a team physically, and you can think about the framing, right? There is a little bit of production aspect to this. How do you want to be face on to the advocate? Do you want to have both team members visible so that you can see visibly the teamwork that you're doing together, assuming you're in the same place? That's discretion. And I think that the only way you can see what works well is by practice. And the great news is that you can practice doing virtual meets like very easily, right? That's not that hard. But there's a lot more to think about. I think it's all the stuff that arbitrators and practitioners are also thinking about: framing, lighting. How's your computer angle positioned? How's your camera framed? What can they see that you have the record in front of you and that you're very confidently and composedly going through the record and guiding them through with those materials? That's all framing, right? So that's the production value of this. I think eye contact takes on a new meaning in this setting. It's actually probably easier. I think in the real world, I have often seen, especially in practice rounds early on, students would be reading their arguments. I think now you have this false method of reading where you could actually have your script. You shouldn't have a script, but if you have a script, you can have it up on the screen and really look like you're very good with eye contact. Or you can do it very badly and make it very obvious that you're reading your screen. But these are tips and tricks, right? They're things you can practice and see, all right, well, how do I come across? So that's assuming you're all together. Then there's the other aspect, which is, what if you're all separated? I don't know what the environment will be this spring. I hope it'll be improved and more people can be gathering. But the reality is that we're presuming there. And last year, very few students were together when they were presenting. My team in particular, they were in different cities, they were in different places, they were very dispersed. And they were operating on crazy time zones, right? Because then you if you're competing virtually, who knows what hour it might be where you're located. So that's something to think about as well. And here, maybe the pause is even more important. I guess is the best advice I can offer. I always advocate for the pause because it sets the tone of the room. But in the virtual room, the pause is even more important because you don't want to talk over somebody. You want to make sure that they're done. You want to be responsive. You want to hear the question to be responsive. And it's hard to do that if there's some kind of delay. And let's not kid ourselves. These virtual platforms are not perfect.
Certainly.
so think about it, right? I mean, you want to practice. I think practice is the only thing that can really help you through those virtual settings. And this year in particular, there's a lot of virtual pre-moots that are happening around the world. So maybe there's an opportunity to work through those kinks. The risk, of course, I mean, I don't know how this is going to go, but the risk, of course, is everybody's using different platforms, right? You use this pre-moot and they have that platform, and then the actual Vis Moot uses a different platform. So try to learn as much as you can about the platforms and the navigability of them before it happens, to the extent that you can. I think being in the same place as your team members is good. But then how many screens do you have? How many computers do you use? Do you share control of the machine that's in front of you? I don't know the answers to these things. I think these are lessons that are yet to be determined. And I think what's amazing, though, regardless of how this all goes, what's amazing for you all as students who are in this environment right now is you're learning alongside the practitioners. You're learning alongside the arbitrators, because this is new for everybody. So you're already ahead of the learning curve in so many ways, because we're all living and learning online right now by necessity. One day that won't be a necessity, but some of this will carry on. I think the virtual hearings are part of our practice and will continue to become more and more part of our practice. And arbitration or court, I think courts are also newly adapting to this. Once upon a time in the US federal courts, if you couldn't appear in person, you appeared by phone, which is, I mean, you think virtual hearings are hard. I mean, phone hearings and being an advocate when you can't even see anybody, I mean, that's painful, right? So I think virtual is the new world for many of us, and it'll happen in all sorts of settings, not just arbitrations. So take this as an opportunity and a challenge. I think that everybody recognizes it's harder to do as well in this setting. So you do the best that you can, and you use it for what it is. I never send my students to the Vis Moot thinking we're going to win, because winning is not the point of it. It's the experience. And what's nice about the Vis Moot and what inspires me to stay involved, I was a mootee in 2009, so more than 10 years now. What inspires me to stay involved is that when I was in law school, it was the one thing that I did that felt like real life. It was the one thing I did that I felt prepared me for what my job was going to become. And this virtual stuff, I mean, this is just an exemplar situation of that. This is real life. We're all living and working in this way. So rise to the challenge and enjoy it for what it is. And it's an educational experience above all else, but it's also a really nice modern approach to how do we do advocacy, and you might figure it out faster than some of the others, and that's great. I mean, faster than the arbitrators, faster than counsel, and then we'll look to you because you're young and savvy.
That's very uplifting, ma'am. But I do hope that this is the last year that all of us will have to make it in a very virtual setting, because let's hope for the better for the world, and it all improves, and it's not a necessity moving on.
I hope so, but that said, I mean, there's a beauty to this as well, which is that it creates more opportunity among students as well. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. Traveling and the cost of traveling, these are distinguishing features, right? And there are the teams that are able to do that and the teams that are not. And so I hope that this is also an impetus for the Vis Moot to grow. And I mean, I don't know what the organizers have planned, but it'll be really interesting to see whether we have many new teams, whether we have many new jurisdictions represented, and that's all quite beautiful. But I'm with you. I'd rather meet you and talk to you than do this.
No, ma'am, I think I echo that sentiment. But yes, as you mentioned, there is a silver lining to everything, and I personally know that there are a few teams from my college itself who are a lot happier because pre-moots have become a lot more accessible to Indian students as well, and so has the moot inherently as well. So with that being said, ma'am, I think this was a very, very insightful conversation, and you ventured into details and nuances that we could not have even fathomed. And therefore, we are extremely grateful for your time and for all the efforts you've put in to just enlighten all aspirants here today. So thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. And I wish everybody the best of luck. I'm sure you'll all be very successful in different ways, and just enjoy the ride. I mean, I think Indian students, it's very much win-lose. I think it's part of the educational culture. It's not about winning or losing. I mean, just enjoy the ride.
Let's hope that people take that to heart. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for your time, and have a very nice day ahead.
Thank you. You as well.
Thank you so much.
So good morning, everyone. We have with us today Mr. Eduardo Lubaton. He's an associate at International Arbitration and Litigation at Horgan Laurels, which is an internationally acclaimed and reputed law firm. Mr. Eduardo's main practice areas are international arbitration, civil and commercial litigation, and antitrust. His passion also lies in academia and is a professor at a university in Mexico. He's published various pieces on civil law, dispute resolution, and is constantly involved in academic events related to his practice areas as a lawyer. He is also a seasoned coach of his alma mater's arbitration teams that participate every year at Willem Vis Arbitration Moot and sits every year as the arbitrator at the Vis competition in Vienna. I've had the genuine pleasure and privilege of being judged by Mr. Eduardo during my time at Vis. And Mr. Eduardo, it's been a genuine pleasure to be in touch with you all these years. So I'm thoroughly excited for this session, and I'm certain that his advice and experiences will genuinely help the participants go ahead a long way in the competition this year. So welcome on board, Mr. Eduardo, from the entire ICAR team.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Tracy. Thank you very much for that very, very kind introduction. And I am very happy to be here.
Okay, so just like our other sessions that we've had with the winning team of Vis in 2019, we have compiled a set of questions prior to the session from students participating in this competition. So coming to the first question. So we know this year, and as for last year too, a virtual round is drastically different from that of an offline round, especially when it comes to using your body language and physical presence to persuade the judges. In this setting, what should be the method adopted by participants to convince the judges and set them apart from other teams?
Okay, so it is a complicated question because so this new reality of virtual hearings, voting, Vis Moot, and in real life arbitration, we're all just getting used to it by now, you know. So I don't think we have yet figured out the exact tricks and ways to actually do it better or different in an online setting. However, I do agree that there are some differences, and I can tell you what I have seen from my experience last year in the Vis Moot and from the few other moot court competitions that I have participated in since then. And I believe that it is just a matter of using the same tricks that you would use in a physical hearing, but these tricks become way more important in a virtual setting. Let me give you a few examples. For example, we know when you have a hearing in person, eye contact is essential to build a rapport with the tribunal and to actually get your point across with the tribunal. Unfortunately, there is not really a good way to make eye contact in a virtual setting. So what I have found that many good teams do is that they kind of fake the eye contact and they look directly at the camera. So they are not actually watching the arbitrators or the other teams, which are somewhere in their screen, but they're actually looking at the camera, and that gives the sense that they're making some kind of eye contact. Second, again, it is always a rule that you should not read your arguments. But in a virtual setting, it becomes way more obvious when you're reading, because you take your eyes off the screen or off the camera, and if you go down like this, all the arbitrators instantly know that you are reading something. So it is even more important in this kind of settings to know your argument by heart. Third thing, again, it is always necessary to speak slower and clear, slower than you usually would in your life. And in a virtual setting, maybe it's even more important to speak even slower and enunciate every word precisely so that they can actually understand with these technical difficulties of using a microphone, or maybe they have not so much power in their speakers or any other trouble. Third, I would say that the emphasis that you put in your argument is also very much important in a virtual setting. It always is, but in a virtual setting, it is easier to be just bored with the argument or just looking at screen. So the changes in intonation or strategic pauses in your argument become much more important in a virtual hearing, even though they would be also important in a hearing in person. So those would be my first recommendations for the teams, that it is usually using the same tricks that you would in a hearing in person, but they become essential, not only important, in a virtual hearing.
Oh, it's actually perfect, Mr. Eduardo, because I think these are maybe like the ancillary factors that maybe we didn't keep in so much of mind at the time of offline rounds, but something even like the teams who have participated last year have constantly mentioned, which sort of sets them apart from other teams. So also just a follow-up question to this, which is very similarly aligned. In situations of this kind where you do not know if the arbitrator is with you or he's following your arguments, or you do not know if he's on the same page as you, because for this competition, you often tend to take the arbitrators through the moot problem. In those situations, what are maybe, again, some of the tokenistic things that maybe students can use to make sure that the arbitrator is completely with you on the arguments that you're talking about?
Okay, so I would maybe divide those questions in two main parts. It is always important to have the attention of the arbitrators with you, whether it is a virtual hearing or a hearing in person. So you absolutely must make sure that the tribunal is understanding your points. And I believe you can do this in two separate moments. First comes the part of preparation. To actually get your points across and make sure that the tribunal will understand that the preparation of your pleading is essential. So that includes, for example, first making use of proper roadmaps in your argument. So you need to have a perfectly good structure of how you're going to present your arguments and tell it to the tribunal with as much clarity as you can. So that starts by saying, I will address, for example, the procedural issues, while my co-counsel will address the substantive. But within your argument, you're going to say, I will address, or I will present to this tribunal two main submissions. First, in this year, for example, would be that Ross Pharmaceuticals should or should not be joined. And second, that the examination of witnesses should or should not be made in a virtual hearing. And then when you go into each of those submissions, you would say something like, Ross Pharmaceuticals should be joined because of three main reasons: first, second, third. And then the tribunal knows what you're going to address, knows where you're going, and that most of the arbitrators actually write it down. So they are with you when you have a proper structure and you tell them what is the proper structure. The second thing in preparation I would do is, if you noticed, I just made a roadmap using my fingers and saying first, second, third. So that visual aid, since in the Vis Moot you cannot actually use a PowerPoint presentation or some other visual aid, when you do that with your fingers, that actually helps the tribunal remember that you're going to make 2 or 3 points. So that is on the part of preparation. On the hearing, which is like the second part of how you make sure that the tribunal is actually with you. First, the best speakers in the Vis Moot and in general in any arbitration hearing know how to read the tribunal, and they need to adapt their presentation to the particular panel that they have in front of them. There are tribunals that do not like to ask many questions, and then they just like to hear the argument just as you prepared it. There are other arbitrators that like to ask a lot of questions, or that would like you to address one point before the other. So if you're able to read that and change your presentation to what the tribunal is expecting, it is way more likely that they're going to stay with you. If you stick to your script, you're just going to lose them, because you're telling them things they are perhaps not interested in. So that comes usually with the questions. So if the arbitrator asks you questions, usually those are the things that are of interest or of particular concern to that arbitrator, and then you can change what you're saying or make greater emphasis in those points, and then you will keep the tribunal with you. And you can actually see when the tribunal is understanding, like they would probably nod or smile, and when they're not, you can also see them, like they're going to have a face of that they're not understanding, or they're going to be looking elsewhere, you know. So those are the two things that I would say. First is preparation, having a clear structure and telling it to the tribunal, and then in the hearing is a matter of reading the tribunal and adapting your presentation to what they are expecting to hear.
Okay. So actually, that was very insightful, because I remember even when we were participating, something that you constantly hear is take us along with your arguments, give us that roadmap, because they want to be on board with whatever you're doing. So I think for participants this year too, just to make sure that they know how to read the tribunal. And I think I've heard students say this, like, how is it even possible to read the tribunal? How do you understand what they want and where they're going ahead with these arguments? So I think just to be able to, Mr. Edward, do you want to interrupt me here?
No.
Oh, okay. No, that was. But then, yeah, it's just, I think, very interesting to be able to understand what the tribunal wants, because a lot of students end up just taking to their draft and being able to say, just reading it out loud, as opposed to understanding what the tribunal wants and delivering that thing to them. So I think that'll be genuinely helpful for any of the participating this year. So coming to our third question. So something that, again, students have asked is that, we've often seen that arbitrators from different jurisdictions have like varying expectations when it comes to participants, in the manner in which they speak, to the manner in which the speech is delivered, to the manner in which the questions are answered. So in such situation, actually quite challenging too, how can students prepare during this month to ensure that this problem is adequately addressed?
Yeah, okay, so that is indeed a big problem of the Vis Moot, but it is also what makes it interesting. So you're absolutely right. Like actually, yeah, from different jurisdictions. For example, I am Latin, and I like people being passionate and moving their hands, and but there are many arbitrators that just do not like that. So yeah, I would say many things. First of all, I believe that there is a generalized understanding on how a pleading should be structured. Of course, each arbitrator will have their particular preferences, but for example, I don't know, the vast majority of arbitrators will agree that one speaker will do procedure and the second will do substance. And then in procedure, you will divide your argument in your two main submissions, and you should dedicate to each submission approximately 7 minutes. So in general terms, I believe that there is an understanding on how it should be structured. But again, yes, all arbitrators have different preferences. And again, you need to be able to adapt to what that particular panel wants from you. So again, you need to read the tribunal and see how they are reacting. If you have a panel of arbitrators that do not really ask many questions, most likely is that they just want to hear you during your speech, and they will make their notes, but they don't want to take you off your roadmap. But there are many arbitrators that are not that way, and when you get a hot bench with a lot of questions, usually they are not interested in a structured speech. They want the answers to their questions, and then you will just adapt, and your structure will for sure change, because the questions are going to take you someplace else of where you want it to be. But that is a good thing. Like you know how to adapt, and you change your structure to what the arbitrators are actually wanting to hear. This is not always evident, because in the Vis Moot, at least in the general rounds, they make a really great effort to have a diverse panel. So they usually have at least one common law and one civil law lawyer. And they also have difference in seniority. So it is not always self-evident, but usually you can tell that there is usually one arbitrator that takes the lead and that sets how the hearing is going to go. So just go with that one and adapt to what they want to do. So that's on the structure. The third thing I would recommend is watch the hearings from previous years. So all the finals are in YouTube, complete, and you can actually see that all the participants in the final structured their argument in a similar way and answer the questions in a similar way. So they got it right. That's why they are there. So if you watch those videos of the finals, you can actually start to understand how you should structure it and how you should answer the questions. And those are really good examples, because usually, again, in the finals, the tribunals are very diverse. Not in age, because they are usually like senior lawyers, but they are diverse in the sense of jurisdictions. So you can like get an idea from that. And the last thing that I would say on this point is I mean, stick to your gut and what you have learned in practices and pre-moots. You simply cannot please everyone. While there is a generalized understanding, there are arbitrators that are just gonna do things that are weird, and you cannot please everyone, and you cannot foresee every possible hearing that is gonna come. So you're gonna have a lot of practice rounds, a lot of pre-moots, and the vast majority of the arbitrators are gonna tell you to do it in a certain way. So I just would do it in that way and hope that you won't get an arbitrator that's gonna do things way different. I mean, it is not very likely that is gonna happen. But if it does happen, just stick to your gut, stick to what you have learned during the pre-moots, and that will usually get you through.
That's actually a very hard answer. I think to a lot of students, I think it'll just be understand that you have to adapt and type dimension to, and just going with your gut. I think you do so many practice rounds for this, sort of get a hang of what the operators want and maybe what sort of questions he's going to lean towards. But then, yeah, I think for participants out there, listen to your gut and just read the tribunal as well as you can. So also, Mr. Eduardo, again, this goes back to some of the ancillary factors that we talked at in the beginning when it comes to mic adjustment and hand coordination and maybe background and all of that. In those situations, these ancillary factors, what is the sort of impact they have in a virtual round as opposed to, when you're doing it in an offline round? These factors don't even matter in most situations. So a lot of students, unfortunately, have issues where there is communication lag or some technical mishaps. And students were curious whether these things will be counted against them or ways in which maybe they can overcome this hurdle to make sure that the round goes as smoothly as possible.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that is a really good point because I do believe that it could have a negative impact if some of those things go wrong. So, yeah, in a virtual hearing, those other factors will unfortunately play a crucial role. So a bad internet connection or a microphone that doesn't work properly or a very dark setting where they cannot see your face. I mean, I'm sure that most arbitrators will understand, but maybe even subconsciously that there is going to be an impact against your score if they cannot hear you properly because they didn't hear your argument, or if the connection is breaking up or whatever. So I believe that there are a number of things that the teams can do to prepare before the hearing. So first of all, they need to choose an appropriate background. So when you have a lot of things in the background, it is distracting. For example, my background is a bad example, so because there may be arbitrators that want to know, I don't know, what those books are or whatever. So if you can have a neutral background, white background, or then you have nothing distracting the arbitrators from what you want to say. So that is the first one. Second, that you have sufficient lighting. So maybe put a lamp or something behind the computer to your face, of course, to the point that you are not blind by it, but so that the arbitrators can actually see you, see your face, see your hands, see your body language. And third, do many practice sessions with that setting. So with that internet connection, with that microphone, so that you can know that it actually works and that reduces the possibility of something going wrong. Unfortunately, even if you take all those measures into account, things just happen sometimes. For example, the team I was coaching last year, we were in the middle of a round in the Vis Moot. This didn't happen in any pre-moot. So in the Vis Moot, we were in the middle of one of the rounds, and the light went out, and we didn't have an internet connection, and we were no longer in the hearing. So we had to improvise and connect the computer to the hotspot in our cell phones, and we found some like we turn on the lamps in our cell phones to put light on the speakers. So yeah, and in the end of the day, something like that happens, you need to rely on your team. But you can do a number of things to prevent that from happening and ensure that you're gonna do that you're not gonna have those issues. So that goes for what you can do beforehand. But second, you can actually use all those things to your advantage in the hearing, so that there are little things that will actually make you look better and maybe get you an even better score. For example, there were many teams last year that were obviously in different places because of lockdown, but they had the exact same background and they dressed very similarly. For example, they used the same tie or something that to tell the tribunal that they were a team, you know. So that looks very good. And second, when it comes to how to put the computer and the camera and where you should be, I would say that you should try to put it not very close to your face so the tribunal can actually see your hands and your body language, so they can look at your desk so the tribunal can see that you don't have anything weird going on there and that it's actually clean so you know the stuff by heart. So yeah, you can use those things even to your advantage and you will get, I don't know how many points, maybe 1 or 2, but everything helps to get into the round of 64. And finally, you mentioned communication lags between the arbitrators and the participants. And yeah, that is, I must confess that is a big problem that I do not have the solution yet. What I have seen that more or less works is, as I said in your first question, you should speak even slower in a virtual hearing. And that also helps with communication lags. So if you're speaking slowly, you give a chance to the tribunal to interject, and you don't get as distracted when they do, because you have a slow pace. And also, if you make strategic pauses at the end of each of your arguments and actually wait to see if the tribunal wants to say something, and just wait, I don't know, for 3 or 4 seconds before you move on to the next argument, that gives them the chance to ask without them being distracting to you because you're not speaking, and that helps everyone. So that is what I have found so far. That is the best way to deal with it. But either way, there are some arbitrators that are just going to interrupt you in the middle of your speech, and I mean it is a weird interaction. But you just answer the question and continue with your argument.
Okay, that's actually really helpful because things that maybe seemingly seem quite hard and difficult at this point when it comes to these virtual rounds, a lot of participants actually have a lot of control over it in terms of repetition and just going over the entire procedure over and over again to at least reduce the possibilities that these mistakes could occur during the virtual rounds. But unfortunately, there are situations that we maybe can't have any sort of control over. So that's unfortunately one of the disadvantages of a virtual run. But to a large extent, like you said, students can prepare for these mishaps and sort of control the eventuality in which their rounds could get interrupted by these small technical errors. So I think, the tips that you gave would honestly help students to be able to make sure that they know what are the sort of precautions, especially the light. I mean, I think that's something that even I'm going to try adopting in my moot because I think it'll just make sure that things are a lot more clearer. And I think my background is something that students should not be having because I feel arbitrators will be very curious what's on those colored papers at the end of the day.
Absolutely, yes.
So that's an example of not being able to use colored papers in the back of your room. So just another, coming to the second last question, actually. So as a former participant of this, something I totally relate with students when they say that, answering questions can be a very daunting task. It's something that students genuinely dread, when they're going through these oral rounds. And we've heard from the winning teams last year how they've handled this difficulty and what they did to overcome this. But as an experienced judge and as an experienced coach, what are some of the tips and tricks that you would suggest to participants to keep in mind when answering these questions and not get bogged by them at the end of the day?
Yes. Okay, so first of all, I agree with you. Answering questions is perhaps the most challenging part of pleading during the Vis Moot. But it's also one of the best opportunities that you have to score more points, to actually show off before the tribunal and to demonstrate your knowledge of the law, your knowledge of the facts, that you paid attention to the opposing counsel, etc. So while it is difficult, or perhaps because it is difficult, it is also the greatest opportunity that you have to score even more points in the hearings. And I would also say that it is perhaps the most entertaining part. In the beginning, it is awful. I remember when I participated and I got asked a lot of questions. I got angry and I just wanted the tribunal to shut up. but when you actually learn how to deal with the questions, it becomes the most entertaining part of the pleading, and you actually want a hot bench and not a tribunal that doesn't ask many questions. But anyway, I understand the difficulty, and I would perhaps make the following suggestions. The first one is, as with everything, practice makes perfect. So the teams should do a lot of practice sessions, and and attend to the majority of frameworks to which they can, which in a virtual setting is easier. And in the practice sessions that you have with your team, make as many questions as you can. That's not going to happen in the actual Vis Moot, but it helps you be prepared to the worst. And when you are doing these practice rounds, or when you're in the premots, someone in your team should be writing down every single question you get asked. So then you have like a little database of questions, and then you will have time to prepare a good and short answer to each of these questions that you can sort of memorize in case it comes up again in the future. There are questions that are just going to come up in every single hearing, and there are some that you simply will not be able to anticipate. You cannot anticipate every single question, but if you make this database of all the questions that you have been asked up until that point, you will be able to anticipate most of them. So that is the first thing that I would say. Practice and make your little database with the proper answers, or the best possible answer that you can come up with. The second is that I would actually say to the participants that questions are an incredible opportunity for you to do two things. The first one is, it is the easiest way to read the tribunal. So the tribunal, perhaps you're speaking about, I don't know, consent on the joinder this year in the Vis Moot. But the tribunal might not be really interested about that. They have already made up their mind about that. So they're going to ask you a question about something else, something that you perhaps are going to say a little bit later in your argument. If you are able to read that, you can use the questions to see what the tribunal is actually interested in. Stop losing time in arguments that are not going to get you any points because the tribunal is not interested in them, and get to the points to which the tribunal actually wants to hear about. So that is the first great opportunity about questions. And the second is that it is a great opportunity for you to show your knowledge. So when you get asked a difficult question that the arbitrator knows is a difficult question, and you answer it correctly, that earns you a lot of additional points. Because the tribunal knows that they put you in a tough spot and you were able to get out of it. So that is the second thing. Do not hate the questions. You should actually love them, because it is the best opportunity you have to make a good hearing. And perhaps the last thing I would say is one of the greatest tricks in the Vis Moot, and you should be able to get right if you want to go into the elimination rounds, is that you should be able to incorporate the answer into your argument. So when the tribunal asks you a question, ideally, you should have thought of that before, and it should be in your argument, because if the arbitrator is asking you that question, chances are it is an important issue. So if you can incorporate it into your argument and actually answer with what you were already going to say, that is just perfect. The tribunal is impressed, and you are still within your roadmap and your script. So everybody's happy. So if you can anticipate all those questions and actually answer it with what you have already thought of before, then your pleading is just amazing.
That's actually perfect. You know, you were talking about creating like this database, like a question bank of sort. And I think this year also, and I think participants who do extremely well at the competition, that's a strategy that they adopt to make sure that even if they can't anticipate all the questions in the world, at least 90% of the job is done. So maybe, you know, in situations where a question is asked, instead of answering it in maybe 1 minute or 2 minutes, participants have got the opportunity to answer that in the best way in like 30 seconds. And that saves up a lot of time. So I think that's something that, you know, participants should genuinely adopt. And I think that's something that even we tried adopting, like making sure that we've prepared all the questions and making sure that the arbitrators get the question on point, as opposed to beating around the bush. And I think that's something arbitrators keep saying, I mean, they should at least avoid at the end of the day.
Actually, yes, I would perhaps add that arbitrators really do not like when you don't actually answer the question. So when you, if they ask a question, they are going to be paying attention to the response. And if you say something that is clearly dodging the question or answering something else, that is not going to help you. Just answer the question, even if it is a tough question. And if that doesn't actually help your case, answer the question, even if it doesn't help your case, and then say to the tribunal, but that is not really the point, or you should also consider these other things. And like, you can do these little caveats after you actually answer the question, but not only focus on those other things, because then the arbitrator feels like you weren't actually listening.
Yeah, exactly. So I think even in situations where you were talking about strategically incorporating these answers into your, draft speech, it becomes so important, because I think something that we've consistently heard from judges and teams is the fact that it doesn't look like a break when you answer the question and when you move back to going back to your speech and giving your argument. So if you can make that transition as smooth as possible, I think that might be the best way you can possibly win. And I remember you mentioning this for one of our rounds, where you told us to incorporate the answers, and that's something that we tried, when we went for the rounds. And I think that sort of stuck with me even when I'm voting right now, to make sure that your answers doesn't seem like a complete, shift from what you've prepared in the draft. So it looks like you've got this roadmap set and you're not deviated. And that's something that arbitrators are often impressed by. So Eduardo, actually, this brings us to the last question. So in your experience as a judge over so many years, teams would have made the cut by the thinnest of margins. And in most cases, all teams have similar arguments, particularly in this, because, you've done so many pre-moots and so many practice rounds, and the arguments sort of become similar at the end of it, more so. In such scenario, what are the factors that often judges like you consider or have noticed that differentiate maybe a good team from some of the excellent teams that you've encountered during these competitions?
Yeah, okay, so that is a tough question, because first of all, yeah, by the time you get into Vienna, yes, the vast majority of the teams have the same argument. They present it in a different way, but the substance is more or less the same. And yeah, most of them are extremely well prepared. So perhaps, I don't know, 100 and 150 of the teams deserve to actually go to the round of 64 in terms of preparation and their performance in the competition. Unfortunately, that is not the case, but they actually deserve it. And of the teams that actually go into the round of 64, I mean, perhaps all of them deserve to win. I actually arbitrated a round in the round of 64 last year, and my co-arbitrators and myself perhaps took, I don't know, more than half an hour trying to decide who should win, because we were really unsure, because both teams did an impressive job. So yeah, it is. I agree with you. It is very difficult. But as you say, I believe it comes to the tiniest things. Either you are the team that make the fewer mistakes, or you are the team that by some minor margin showed some extraordinary knowledge of the facts. So let me give you a few examples of what I've seen that are absolutely great teams in the Vis Moot and in other court competitions. First of all, great teams have an amazing research behind them. And what I mean by that is, of course, they know the facts and they know the law. That is like a given. But the research goes really beyond that. I've seen teams in the elimination rounds that actually know the names of the arbitrators of every case law they are quoting in their speech, and even know the details of case law that is not actually in their speech, but that the arbitrator mentioned or that the opposing counsel mentioned. So their research is superior than the rest of the teams. So that is one particular thing that sets them aside. Second, they know the record backwards and forwards. The vast majority of the teams know the record, and they are more or less able to tell you, I know that is in the notice of arbitration or in procedural order number 2. They more or less know, but but the great teams know, without even looking at the record, that the answer to that question is in procedural order number 2, paragraph whatever. So that is an impressive knowledge of the record. What I tell the students that I coach is that they should read the record at least twice every day, in the morning and before they go to sleep at night. Read it again. I know that they have already read it, but these problems in the Vis Moot are really well done, and you will find new things in the record even to the last day of pleadings. So that is the second thing. They know the record better than the average team. Third, they usually manage to be incredibly responsive. So being responsive is extremely important when you're the second speaker in the pleading. And great teams really nail listening to their opposing counsel, actually writing down what they said, and they have an answer to each and every point they made, not just some of them, but all of them. So that also sets them apart. And that also gives them the ability to make really impressive rebuttals, because they really touch on the point that is the most harmful to the opposing counsel, or that perhaps was of the most interest to the arbitral tribunal. And rebuttals, as with answering questions, are perhaps the things that get you the most points when you do it right. Again, as I said, they are great at adapting to the tribunal, at reading the tribunal, and adapting to what they are asking or what they want to know about. They never go over time. They always end up exactly at 14 minutes of their pleading. So it comes to those little things, in the elimination rounds, when you're in the round of 32, I mean, your opposing counsel is going to be good. They're going to know the law, they're going to know the facts, and it's going to be a tough round. So it comes to who makes the least mistakes. And perhaps you ended up in 14 and they went 4 seconds over the time limit. Or perhaps you knew a precedent that the tribunal mentioned and your opposing counsel didn't. Those are tiny things, but that is what is going to set you apart from the rest and maybe get you into the elimination rounds or not.
I think those
and sorry, I forgot one last thing. And also, maybe the team should remember that unfortunately there is a little bit of luck involved in this. So yeah, unfortunately, if you, I don't know, get an arbitrator that was in a bad mood, or if that day you were a little bit more distracted than your opposing team or whatever, there is those luck factors are going to affect the final result. But great preparation and repeating a lot your argument and knowing the record and knowing the law is going to reduce the possibility that luck has a very huge impact.
Definitely. I think also, like what you mentioned, is attention to details to the end. I think that's what's going to help participants, make sure that they go ahead, because what you see in prelim rounds often is that almost all the arguments are the same. Almost, when people win, there is a bit of a margin. It is not as close as maybe what happens in the rounds of 64, 32, 16, where, teams win by maybe a mark point and a half, like what you said, maybe just lesser mistakes. And if the arbitrator's in a good mood and they like the arguments, then well and good. So I guess it's just as much as, what we can get from the entire session is just practice as much as you can. Make sure that you're used to the setting. Make sure that teams repeat their arguments, go make a question bank, and just give a lot of attention to these details that may seem ancillary, but those are the tokenistic things that going to give them those brownie points that pushes them in the competition like as much as they want to go. So, Mr. Eduardo, I want to say this marks the end of our session today, and I just want to thank you so much for coming on board and sharing your advice and invaluable insights into the Vis competition. And we hope all those watching this video finds it as enriching and as helpful as it possibly can, because these are suggestions that I would genuinely recommend that you include in your preparation during this month and go ahead with all the luck possible. So For all our followers out there, do stay tuned. We have more sessions lined up with practitioners and teams from other arbitration competitions too, which we believe will genuinely be helpful in any sort of preparation, not just exploring these subject areas. So thank you for tuning in, and best of luck for all the participants. And thank you, Eduardo, so much for joining us.
Now,
everyone. In continuation of the Vis series on Arbitration Connect, we have with us today Ms. Ashna Taneja. A little bit of background about Ashna. Ashna is a senior lawyer at the National Indigenous Australians Agency, where she's primarily involved in legal and strategic advice on projects that basically support Indigenous businesses and Indigenous Australians. She has previously contributed to trade law policy development, both at UNCITRAL and UNIDROIT. She maintains a connection with arbitration as a member of the Young International Arbitration Group and Young ICCA, among other things. But what jumps out most about Ashna is that she's a seasoned orator for a long time now, having received various laurels across an assortment of international moots, mediation and negotiation competitions, and MUNs as well. In particular, she has been involved in the Willem Vis Moot, both in the capacities of a speaker in 2015 and more recently as a coach of her alma mater in 2019. Can I first just say that we are so excited to have someone of your caliber and experience to speak with us today. And we are really certain that your suggestions will definitely help our target audience.
No, well, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me. It's very kind words of you to say.
It's entirely our pleasure. So if you don't mind, I'd like to proceed to asking you a set of questions that we've compiled based on the most common requests we have from various students that are participating in the competition this year. Sure. So for the sort of first question, you've journeyed from a participant in 2015, like I said, to a coach later in 2019. You do certainly seem to have a strong affiliation for the Vis Moot. Are there any particular reasons that draw you to the Vis Moot in particular? And what do you think sort of sets it apart from many other arbitration moots that there are?
So it's the largest arbitration moot in the entire world. It brings, routinely over 300 teams from across the world. You get to make friends in every corner of the globe. And I think that was for me the most exciting part. But on top of that, the Vis Moot does attract people who are really genuinely friendly, down to earth. I've just had the most positive experiences with the people that have been involved. And the people who are more senior to you, who come as arbitrators or coaches, often are really genuinely invested in helping you along that trajectory should you want to pursue it as a career or through academia or whatever it may be. Or even if you don't want to do that and want to do something completely separate. It's just a really great community of people to be involved with. And I think for me, that's what's kept me involved throughout. But on top of that, I think that what sets the Vis Moot problems apart from other moots is that, and I guess this is a feature of arbitration moots, so this is a bit more of a distinction between courtroom style moots and arbitration moots, is that it is very factual based. Often, in the courtroom style, you are mooting an appeal and you're getting into the intricacies of the law. But what the Vis Moot really opens up a world to is, when you're at trial and you have the materials before you, how do you persuade your arbitrator, your side, of the picture? How do you use the facts? And I think that's, something which is, a really valuable skill to have. But on top of that, the problems are all kinds of weird and wacky, from, wine producers to horse seamen, as it was in the year I coached last. So never a dull moment. For all those reasons, I'm continually drawn to the Vis Moot. And although I haven't been involved as a coach this year, I am looking forward to getting involved and assisting a couple of teams along the way.
That's amazing. And actually, something funny that you brought up, the products that are involved in the moot are always funny. And I hear that the prize is eventually for the final winners is eventually somehow related to the product, and there's a memento of sorts. How fun would that be?
There's always some kind of connection, and there's always some kind of even trivia night, which the Moot Alumni Association runs, and they have some pretty interesting prizes. I know that someone that I'm friends with, who was at the Moot that I was at last, who won this, I think it was like a horse on a stick, which was symbolic of the horse, related products that were, the feature of the Moot that we had. So yeah, there's always fun going around. And I think that's the beauty of it, is that, it's a competition, but it's also lighthearted. So, you come away from it, feeling great and making friends. And I think that's one of the things that's a little bit of a shame, in this COVID environment. But I think the fact that, we do have this buzzing Facebook group, does, keep the vibe up, with memes and, people checking in and organizing practice moots. And so the community lives on.
Yeah, definitely can understand now why you've remained a permanent fixture in this sort of group. Actually, my second question is something that you touched upon a little bit when you spoke about the difference between, other moot courts and maybe like a trial in the way that an arbitration moot proceeds. So from your record, obviously, you've done a lot of arbitration moots, even apart from Vis, but you've also done the Oxford Intellectual Property Moot, and you've also done the Nelson Mandela World Human Rights Moot, which are more of general international law moots. So we were wondering, are there any differences in this sort of speaking approach that speakers need to take in a general international law moot such as these versus arbitration moot, that is the Willem C. Vis? Are there like changes that need to be made in terms of demeanor or speaking style when, speakers that have maybe not done an arbitration moot so far need to sort of adapt to?
So I think we touched on this before, which is that often the courtroom moots are an appeal. And so you are looking at the intricacies of the law, whereas we're looking at, making the decision from the very start. And so I guess, that structurally does change things, and it does allow you to, look at the facts, to debate the facts a little more. And whereas, when you're doing a courtroom style moot, you are given the facts are given, and that's not, for you to debate or critique or bring in new ones or whatever it may be. So I think that's one thing that you have to get used to when you are transitioning from a courtroom style moot to a more Vis Moot style. The other, I think, big thing is that the Vis Moot and arbitration moots are generally less formal and a bit more conversational. So I think the tip that I like to give to students when they're new to this is to think about how you would explain a research memo to a law firm